I invite you to turn to Proverbs chapter 23. Proverbs chapter 23. Over the years, I have covered portions of Proverbs 23 multiple times. And I counted probably 5 or 6 times in the last several years we've at least come to Proverbs 23, but want to approach it from a little different angle tonight on unpackaging what the human writer was trying to accomplish here and what that looks like for us. Brother Michael prayed for the unsaved, but I want to stop and just pray for our hearts that we'd be ready to receive what God has for us. We don't want to miss that. Do you want to miss it? Let's make sure we're all together on this and pray and ask God's help. Heavenly Father, thank you for Proverbs and how practical it is. Help us to understand the sayings of the wise in these few verses and understand your heart behind it. And may it spill over and affect our youth. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Countless times over the years, I've been sitting in a pew sitting next to one of my littles, ages 5, 6, 7 years old, and the preacher is waxing eloquent, and he's not ready to land the plane. And sure enough, little guy leans over to me and says, is he almost done? That's a regular thing. Mom and Dad, you know what I'm talking about. When can I go to the bathroom? That's the only thing on their mind. Now, what that reveals is their default mode. They're utterly bored. They're utterly bored by what's going on around them. But what is concerning is that as they grow older, that can translate into staring at their shoes and messing with their shoelaces rather than paying attention. Their teen years are whipping out their cell phone and they're checking their social media feed to see, what the latest is. Or they learn a little bit more culture as they go into their young adult years, and they're still kind of a space cadet as the word is being preached. They're just bored with it. That's the tendency in all of our youth. Have you considered that? That's the default mode that all of our youth will go, and it starts when they're 4, 5, 6, saying, is he done yet? Are we almost over? So what I want to do is talk to you this evening about convincing youth of truth. Convincing youth of truth in Proverbs chapter 23. Now, a little background before we read the actual text. Solomon wrote the majority of Proverbs, but he was not the only author in Proverbs. You find a man named Agur in Proverbs chapter 30. You find the men of Hezekiah pulling Solomon's sayings in chapter 25, verse 1. But in chapter 22, verse 17, it's interesting because Solomon has been talking to his son. He's been giving different tidbits of wisdom. But in 22:17, the scriptures say, bow down thine ear and hear the words of the wise and apply thine heart unto my knowledge. Basically, the way this book is laid out and in the way it was originally written, we're moving on from Solomon speaking to just various sayings or words of the wise. So what would wise men say? And these were, following this is 30 different sayings or words from here to the end of chapter 24 that wise men had shared in the years leading up to this point when they finally compiled Proverbs in the days of Hezekiah. And so that's the context here. So this isn't just Solomon. It could have been Solomon as one of the wise men that wrote chapter 23. But this is what wise men would say. We're going to look at the sages of the past, probably close to about 3,000 years ago. What did wise men say back in this day? When we come to chapter 23, I want to focus on about 8 of those words or those sayings in verses 13 through the end of the chapter, because I believe it hits 3 key components that are needed if youth will be convinced of truth. I want that. You want that? And boy, we want our youth, whether you're a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle, whether you're a Sunday school teacher, we want our youth to be convinced of truth, to run with it for themselves. So pick up with me in verse 13 of Proverbs 23. Withhold not correction from the child, for if thou beatest him with the rod, he shall not die. Thou shalt beat him with the rod and shalt deliver his soul from hell. So that's one saying. And then it moves on to another saying in verse 15. My son, if thine heart be wise, my heart shall rejoice, even mine. Yea, my reins shall rejoice when thy lips speak right things. So that's a second saying. Move on to the third saying in verse 17 and verse 18. Notice what it says. Let not thine heart envy sinners, but be thou in the fear of the Lord all the day long. For surely there is an end, and thine expectation shall not be cut off. Okay, so what would another wise man say? Well, here's another saying in verse 19. Hear thou, my son, and be wise, and guide thine heart in the way. Be not among winebibbers, drunks is what it's referring to, among riotous eaters of flesh. For the drunkard and the glutton shall come to poverty, and drowsiness shall clothe a man with rags. Another sage chimes in. Look at verse 22. Hearken unto thy father that begat thee, and despise not thy mother when she is old. Buy the truth and sell it not. Also wisdom and instruction and understanding. Another saying in verse 24. The father of the righteous shall greatly rejoice, and he that begetteth a wise child shall have joy of him. Thy father and thy mother shall be glad, and she that bare thee shall rejoice. And then in verse 26, we have the longest saying of this passage when we talk about just an ongoing dialogue between a father and his son about two subjects we'll get into here in a few moments. The subject of women and alcohol. Something needy for all teen young men. And evidently there was a sage who had a teen son and he wanted to share that with his boy. So he would get that. So how do wise men convince youth of truth? Now we've been on a journey so far that basically we had the first chair of Joshua, we had a second chair of elders that outlived Joshua, and a third chair of a generation that knew not the Lord. And we've been trying to focus on how we convince the up and rising generation to stay in the first chair. So how can we make them want that? What can we do to cultivate that desire where they are convinced of truth for themselves? And I believe there's three tidbits from sages here in this passage. The first one is, wise men instill cause and effect in youth. Wise men instill cause and effect in youth. Look at what it says in verse 13. Withhold not correction from the child. Well, why? For if thou beatest him with the rod, he shall not die. Okay, so that's kind of a harsh way of putting it. You're going to say that if you withhold the rod, he's going to die? Well, he elaborates on it a little bit more in verse 14 when he says, thou shalt beat him with the rod and shalt deliver his soul from hell. So let me ask you a question in verse 13. Based on verse 13, without the rod, without discipline, where will a child end up? Talk to me for a moment. Hell. So that means something. From a womb, as cute as that little child is that child grows up and is showing all these abilities and this personality. What is the default mode of that child? What is the direction of that child? Say it with me. We're talking about the depravity of man. The heart is deceitful above all things, desperately wicked. Who can know it? Proverbs 22, verse 15. Foolishness is bound in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction shall drive it far from him. Now, this puts it in perspective as far as the cause and effect, because basically, this wise man is saying, waywardness should hurt. Waywardness should hurt. It's uncomfortable. When you stray, you get bit with whatever consequences might be out there. Now, it's interesting the way this is laid out, discipline is a rescue mission from hell. And so some people view it as abuse as far as, well, that's mean to give consequences to a child or to apply the rod of discipline, to have some kind of, quote, punitive punishment for what they did. But the picture is they are on this way, and so physical discomfort intervenes and is a rescue mission to keep them from going that way. So they would learn. Say, I don't want to go that way because it hurts. And a wise man is saying that waywardness should hurt. And if we can create that environment in our homes, and I realize sometimes in our classrooms, now we're not proposing that our teachers spank at Hillview Baptist Church, I want to be clear on that. But there's ill effects. Like you act up in class, you miss out on class, you're going and sitting with your mom and dad in church, in big churches. It's really boring out there compared to our junior church. I mean, there's ill effects of that. And there's just a cause and effect. There's a waywardness. Waywardness does hurt. This can be seen in so many different ways. When they're that cute little toddler and you say they're not supposed to, that's a no touch, don't touch the outlet. They do, a flick on their hand, it hurts them. It's a discomfort. That's not punitive. Waywardness is uncomfortable. When they get a little older and they neglect to clean up their dirty room, well, they miss out on the bike ride with their buddies because they neglected their room. That hurts. Waywardness hurt. As they get a little older and they sass mom and talk back to her a little bit, it hurts to sit in your room the rest of the evening. You can't do anything. You're stuck there. You don't have a gaming console. You don't have a TV. Your phone is taken from you. You just got to sit in your room the rest of the night for the way you talk to your mom. Or you yell at your dad. Okay, this is going to get a little more punitive. You yell at your dad, it's going to probably afflict your hind end a little bit when you yell at your dad. And so the idea is this: waywardness hurts. And the wise man is saying that when a child strays as they're growing up, there ought to be a negative effect that they can feel. You say, well, doesn't education straighten people out? I was at the U of O campus last Friday. I mean, the educated elite in our area, and a bunch of 18 and 19-year-olds. It was 80 degrees outside. I mean, the girls were out in bikini tops. The guys are shirtless. They were chugging water balloons at each other. I'm like, man, this education is really straightening them out, isn't it? Really maturing them. Okay, I'm being a little sarcastic. You get my drift. Education doesn't straighten people out. Discomfort can help with that a little bit. As they learn that, okay, there's a waywardness here, it ought to afflict, it ought to be uncomfortable as a result. But then also there's a positive side to that in verses 15 and 16. My son, if thine heart be wise, my heart shall rejoice, even mine. Righteousness, on the other hand, brings joy. In other words, son, you do what's right. I'm thrilled. That's great. There's blessing in that. You have my approval. I'm going to give you privileges, and you'll be able to go further. That word rejoice appears twice, and that word literally means to triumph. This is victory. We won, son. You cleaned up your room. Good job. You did it this time. You followed through. But it's not a point of getting them hooked on the approval of mom and dad the rest of their life. We're setting them up to seek approval from their ultimate authority, that is their God. And so that as they navigate through life, they know when I do right, my Heavenly Father is pleased. And He is triumphing over this. He's joyfully saying, well done, thou good and faithful servant. And we instill that in our kids at an early age. So what does that look like specifically? Well, when they do their chores promptly and it's maybe been a struggle, it's okay to commend your kids on that. Say, good job. Because they'll know, okay, when I do that, there's a positive effect from my mom and dad. You know, when they actually take care of their responsibility and they're working on a project in the garage or the basement, they clean up all their tools and they put them away, okay, well, Daddy will entrust you to more use of the tools because you stewarded those tools. I mean, there's a blessing that comes with that. There's a positive effect with that. Now, what I am not saying is just because they sat still in church, they deserve Dutch Brothers every time. I'm not saying that. That's going to spoil the kid. if like every slight action gets, a popsicle or a sucker or a piece of candy, every time they do something good, they get something sweet or they get this, tangible reward, well, that's going a little overboard because that's not real life. Every time you get right, you don't get a lollipop as an adult. And so we got to use some balance and some wisdom with that because we were trying to prepare them for real life. So wise men, they instill cause and effect in their youth. You stray, it hurts. You do right, there's blessing. The relationship with mom and dad is awesome when you're doing right. There's reward with that. And the wise men say, make sure there's that cause and effect in our youth. But notice secondly, and this is one, don't tune out when I use this word, okay? Because you might jump to the wrong conclusion. But wise men, based on verses, we're going to jump to verse 19. We'll come back to verse 17 here in a few moments. In verse 19, wise men vaccinate youth against temptation. They vaccinate youth against temptation. You say, oh man, what do you mean by this? Are we getting political here? No, not at all. Because right now, it's the craze. I mean, like, if you get vaccinated, you got that time written on your car window, right? That's a big deal. And because we're fighting against COVID, and that's the rage right now. But taking that over to the spiritual realm, if people want to do that for a virus, to get vaccinated against a virus, they're taking a controlled evil, in a sense, and putting it in their body to build up a resistance to that. So their body can fight that off and ward that off. In the same way as our kids grow up, they need to be exposed to some temptation in a, hear me out, a controlled environment. So they're aware of what's out there. Now, let me be clear on what I am not saying. I'm not saying that you just let your kids go out and explore the world on their own. They can just go whatever they want. They can dabble in this, dabble in that. No, that's not controlled. I'm not saying either that we isolate our children in a way where they are clueless on what is out there in the world. The balance between the two, between just letting them go wild in the world, go wherever they want, there's no restrictions whatsoever. Oh, yeah, son, you can just take my tablet and look at anything you want on YouTube. No, that's dangerous. Or to say, no, you can never use any technology, you can never dabble with anything like that, you're restricted from ever playing with any friends. No, you can't go to that place. I mean, it's no for everything. There's no exposure whatsoever. Well, that's isolation. That's setting them up to probably be a little naive when they get older. And so the balance is, and you see this throughout Proverbs, is to vaccinate our children against those worldly temptations so they build up some kind of resistance or immunity to it. So what do you mean by that? Well, let's look at what the wise man says here in verse 19. Hear thou, my son, and be wise, and guide thine heart in the way. Be not among winebibbers, among riotous eaters of the flesh. So stay away from the drunk, okay? Because they're going to take you down a slippery slope. Well, what does that look like? Well, that's what he says in verse 21. It's almost like he goes to downtown Eugene, or maybe takes someone on a trip to just a rough part of town. And it says in verse 21, for the drunkard shall come, or the drunkard and the glutton shall come to poverty, and drowsiness shall clothe a man with rags. Hey, son, let's go on a trip right now. Let's go on a trip. Hey, you see all your buddies and the fun they have on Friday nights? They come back on Monday morning talking about all the fun they had. Let me tell you where that leads. Let's do some show and tell. Now, this is what it equals right here. You see that? Is that really what you want? What's happening? You're vaccinating them. You're instilling some resistance, realizing that, okay, this is the big picture. This is what will happen if I go down that way. Because they're going to be tempted. They will be tempted. You cannot shield them from temptation forever. You might as well vaccinate them against the temptation while they're still in your home. It goes on and gives a little different twist beginning in verse 23. I'm sorry, I'm going to jump down to verse 27. Got ahead of myself there. It says, For a whore is a deep ditch, and a strange woman is a narrow pit. She also lieth in wait as for a prey, and increaseth the transgressors among men. So again, I want to immunize my son against the strange woman. And so as the son's getting older, all the cooties just fall off of females, and they start looking really good. There's a temptation. And as they're looking really good, there needs to be some immunization that's happened where we talk about those things. What happens as far as where those desires lead and why God gave you those desires and the purpose of those desires and what happens when you abuse those desires. And if that doesn't take place, they're going to go hog wild, man, as soon as their restrictions are lifted because they don't know how to handle it. They never had those talks. And so this wise man is saying, son, let's talk about this. Let's talk about the strange woman. Now you say, what is the strange woman? The strange woman is someone that you know physically, but they are a stranger to you emotionally and spiritually. Did you get that? The strange woman is someone that you know physically, but is still foreign to you emotionally and spiritually. That's why she's strange. And the ideal is, and this is a good talk to have with both sons and daughters, is, hey, as you get into a relationship, you need to focus on that spiritual side first and know her or him spiritually. And then emotionally, and then after you say I do at the wedding altar, then physically. It needs to go in that order. Reversing that, it's a strange relationship. It's not the right way of handling that and navigating that relationship. And having those talks is a healthy thing to do. So what does that look like specifically? Well, Solomon did that in Proverbs chapter 7. We don't have time to get there in detail, but he addresses his son in chapter 7, verse 1. And he gets pretty graphic, talking about a simpleton walking down the street, turning the corner to her house. And she goes out and flatters him, and she's dressed up exotically and says, the good man is gone, come, let us drink of loves until morning. It's fairly risque. That was written to a son. Why? To immunize him, to vaccinate him and say, son, do you really want to be like an ox going to the slaughter? That's how the passage ends. Like a deer that's being speared. Do you really want that? And some vaccination is taking place in Solomon's son's life, God willing, that's his desire anyway, in Proverbs chapter 7. And so that would be a very specific example of that immunization going on in Proverbs. So what does this look like for us specifically? You immunize your youth when you talk with them about world events and what's going on in our world. When you have all the headlines covering the potential protests in Minneapolis over the verdict of a jury, as we saw yesterday, it's good to talk about that. Talk about people's waywardness and how people try to manipulate situations, put pressure on jurors and judges. That's a great talking point when it comes to world events. When you're out and about and you see that person that's just kind of twitching, walking down the road, that's a good talking point for a child to explain what's going on there. And to not get graphic in a way that's tempting, but graphic enough for them to know what's going on in something like that, so they will be immunized against that temptation, because inevitably they're going to probably have an opportunity at one point in their life to go that road. We immunize our children, dads, when we get away with our sons and we have the birds and bees talk, which, dads, I highly advise you to do that as your sons are navigating those teen years. Hey, moms, get away with your daughters before they start going through that time in life where things are all of a sudden changing. Do you want the world to be translating that to them? Or do you want to be the one interpreting that to them? That's part of the immunization process, just to make sure we give context to this and they understand what's going on. And we have those talks, and there's open dialogue and open communication. You see this in the heart of Solomon, and you see this in the heart of the wise men right here in Proverbs chapter 23. So wise men vaccinate youth against temptation. We all together so far? Nobody flew out the bus window in frustration about that thought, because I realize that's a little different angle from what we've talked about in the past. But still, wise men vaccinate youth against temptation. But that leads us to a third essential and convincing youth of truth. Wise men persuade youth of the right way. There's a convincing continually going on. It's almost like we're selling them on, this is the right way. Believe me. So what does this look like? Well, if you look at going back to verse 17, it says, let not thine heart envy sinners, but be thou in the fear of the Lord all the day long. For surely there is an end, and thine expectation shall not be cut off. You know what this wise man is doing? He's zooming out and said, hey, you might look at what your buddies have with their nice phones and the nice car that mom and dad just handed to them and all these devices and no restrictions whatsoever, and they can just surf whatever they want on the internet, and they have free reign. You might be envious of that, but let me talk to you about the long term. And one of the greatest ways we convince youth of the right way is to talk about the big picture. And that's what this wise man is doing in verses 17 and 18. Talk about the blessings of serving God. Talk about the blessings of saying no early on for the sake of greater blessing down the road. And that's what Solomon is trying, or this wise man is trying to do. But then look at the passion if you jump down to verse 22. It says, hearken unto thy father that begat thee, and despise not thy mother when she is old. Buy the truth, and sell it not. Also wisdom and instruction and understanding. Can you see this mother and this father pleading with their teen daughter, their teen son, saying, please, buy it. There's a cost to it. I'm going to be up front. You're going to have to give a lot up front. You're going to have to say no and deny your flesh. But in the long run, if you say no and you give up certain things that other kids are enjoying right now, man, I'm telling you, it's going to be so much more enjoyable down the road. So listen to me, son. There's just a desire in mom and dad that exudes out of them that young adult, that teenager can see in their parents. So plead with them. Also point out the rewards in verses 24 and 25. The father of the righteous shall greatly rejoice, and he that begetteth a wise child shall have joy of them. Thy father and thy mother shall be glad, and she that bare thee shall rejoice. In other words, you get the reward of a sweet relationship with mom and dad. Now, teens and even preteens, Micah, Caden, I'm talking to Elijah, Joseph, Nathaniel, Joshua, Josiah. Is it fun when things are sweet with mom and dad? Help me out for a moment. Do you enjoy that when things are sweet with mom and dad? Let me tell you, I can keep things sweet with mom and dad. You obey them. Let me try that one more time. I set mom and dad up on that one, and some of you just struck out, okay? All right? Let me try that one more time. You know how to have a sweet relationship with mom and dad? You obey them. Okay, that's a little better. But when you do what is right, it makes for an enjoyable relationship with parents. It really does. I mean, any reasonable parent, when their kids obey them, is going to get better and sweeter. And that's what the wise sage is saying here in verses 22 through 24. But there's one other way, and I come down to verse 26, and in some ways this could be the most essential way of selling our kids or convincing our kids of the right way. It says, my son, give me thine heart, and let thine eyes observe my ways. Son, will you entrust your heart to me and then look at the way that I am going, that I'm striving for? It's not perfect. I'm not impeccable. I still have my shortcomings. I still got my warts. But I'm at least striving. Would you look at that example and follow me in that example? Paul lived by that philosophy. As he visited the Ephesian elders in Acts chapter 20, he bore his heart to them and said, "Ye know from the first day that I came into Asia, after what manner I have been with you at all seasons, serving the Lord with all humility of mind and with many tears and temptations which befell me by the lying in wait of the Jews." Saying, hey, from the first day I was authentic. You saw me weep. You saw the temptations. You saw the trials. But at the same time, you saw the faithfulness. And moms and dads, grandma and grandpa, aunts, uncles, Sunday school teachers, your most basic platform for any influence is your example. If we don't have the example out before our children, it doesn't matter what you say. They're not listening. Their ears are plugged if that example is not in line with what you're saying. But when we live that life in front of them, we're striving, far from perfect, but nonetheless we're going in that way. And they see that we're real, we're authentic. That lays the foundation for all other influence. Son, let thine eyes observe my ways. I love those times when we've had younger missionaries or preachers into our home whose fathers were preachers themselves. And I always ask them the same question. I'm predictable when it comes to this. I ask them, what did your mom and dad do to instill in you to have a heart for God and specifically a heart for ministry? Because here you are in ministry just like your daddy was. What do your parents do? Time and time again, I've heard one of two things, if not both. The first one is my parents always made sure that they had our heart. They had a relationship with us. But secondly, they lived it and they were always real. They were real. They were authentic. They weren't phony. That inspires me. In other words, the way I'm going to convince my kids of the right way is to live it in front of them. That's foundational. So bringing all this together, how do wise men convince youth of truth? The first way is wise men instill cause and effect in youth. Waywardness hurts. Righteousness brings joy. Secondly, wise men vaccinate youth against temptation. It's okay to inoculate your kids a little bit to the world in a controlled environment. And then thirdly, wise men persuade youth of the right way through the big picture, through pleading with them, through rewards, and through living an example before their eyes. So you bring all this together. Let's just be people that are deliberate in convincing youth of truth. Let's be calculated. We might not be perfect. We might not have an impeccable strategy. There are certain bad days where, man, that came unraveled. That flew like a lead balloon. But let's at least be deliberate and have a heart's cry in our lives that we are constantly striving to convince our youth of truth. And I believe this is a glimpse of what it might look like. Caleb, can you come up to the platform? So when our kids are young, as we convince them of truth, honestly, the early days are just like this. They're just riding on our shoulders. Wherever we go, they go. I have faith. He has faith. I'm going to church. They're going to church. No questions asked. Hey, son, what do we do on Sundays? What do we do on Sundays? Yeah. It's non-negotiable. We go to church. That's just what we do. And so he's riding shoulders, riding piggyback, and that's just that's all we do. It's expected. It's non-negotiable. But as they get a little older, into those teen years, he needs to start making some decisions on his own. Because I can't be giving Elijah a shoulder ride anymore. So it's time for him, as he gets a little older, to hop down. And then I try to lead by example, and I say, okay, hey, son, let's go do this together. And he follows me. He's just following me. I'm going over here, and so he's trying to follow my example. Okay, let's go over here. Let's go follow this example right over here. He's following me. He's starting to make some decisions on his own. It's no longer riding on dad's shirt tails quite as much, or riding on dad's shoulders or piggyback. But then the day's coming when he's 17, 18, 19 years old that he's ready to spread his wings. And then at that point, I've tried to coax the path to say, hey, son, go this way, go this way. So what are you going to do, son? What are you going to do? Okay, good job, good job. He's going to go on that path, right, on his own. Good job, Caleb. You see the process that happens over time? You're going to limit your teens, your young adults, if you're still trying to get them to ride on your shoulders when they're 17, 18 years old. It's not going to work. It's going to backfire. At the same time, if you're turning them loose like that when they're 4 or 5, that's going to backfire as well. It's a process. We got to make sure they start on their shoulders, then they're following us, and then we send them out to spread their wings, and we pray, by the grace of God, they choose that path we've laid before them. Let's go and stand, the heads bowed and eyes closed.